Hello, wonderful listener. Cass here, jumping in with some content warnings before we get started with this week's episode. Thank you, as always, for checking out the podcast and just giving us a listen. That means so much to us. We are talking about real person fiction and real person fan fiction this weekend, so that comes with a whole litany of things. This episode is relatively historical and positive and lighthearted, I would like to think, but there is some passing mention of some stuff that has happened and continues to happen within this subset of media that is important to note. So, content warnings for this episode include mentions of, and it's not limited to, ABO or alpha beta omega dynamics, incest, invasion of privacy, molestation, necrophilia, objectification, uncomfortable fan interactions with actors, assault, conspiracy and speculation about the sexuality of others, especially celebrities, and stalking. These are all in passing. There's also a lot of name dropping. Just in talking about celebrities. But if you're okay with all of this, please head forth into the episode and enjoy. Hi, welcome to Author's Note.
Don't listen.
My name is Cass.
And my name is Teese.
Teese, how are you doing this week?
I'm okay. How are you?
I'm good. We both had some dog trouble prior to recording. Would you like to share your dog trouble?
Peaches would not come inside, that insufferable little girl. I literally had to so as soon as I was like, Peaches, come inside, she's pretty good about coming in, but no, she went to go hide in the garage because we have a detached garage, and then she wouldn't come in. So then usually what happens is I'll let Reggie out for 30 seconds and then she'll follow him back inside, because Reggie's one of those I piss, I come inside, do not talk to me.
What a fantastic little man.
That's the only good thing about him. And then I was like, Peaches, come in. And then she went to go hide under the deck because we have a little doorway underneath my deck that we could lift up and then take out dried wood for our chimenea. So, yes, my mom thinks of a lot of things.
I like that, though. There's something magical about that, but also deeply cursed. That's where children crawl and then get trapped and a monster gets them.
Yes. I've also one time got out of the house and crawled under there at 1 o'clock in the morning. I was miserable.
Bass, please.
It's okay. She came inside. I literally lured her back in with a crinkled receipt. So Peaches just wouldn't come inside. And then I finally took a treat to her nose. And then as she went to go slowly eat it, I grabbed her by the collar and dragged her inside. And then when I went to go give it to her once we got inside, she just refused to eat it. And then she curled up in a corner. I'm just hoping she's okay. So, what is your dog issue of the week?
I'm watching my parents' dogs because they are away for a funeral, and my parents have 2 French bulldogs, as you know, and Tinkerbell is a delightful little creature who is appropriately sized and shaped and behaves very well, as much as a small dog who's never been trained can. Because my parents did that wonderful thing that everybody does, where they got a small dog and then didn't train it.
Yes.
But Goliath, who is appropriately named for his abnormal largeness.
Did you know he was going to be this sized?
No, they didn't. They didn't. He's not an appropriate size for a French bulldog. He's more the size of a small English bulldog. It's ridiculous. And he likes to, I wouldn't really call it snuggling, because he just likes to stand on top of you and stare at you. But he is the most stubborn dog I have ever met. And when you start a walk with him to try and get him to go to the bathroom, he doesn't want to leave the house. And then about midway through the walk, he doesn't want to go back. And then he decides he would like to go back, but buddy, we're already a considerable distance from the house, so I have one dog who's happily trotting along and I'm trying to get her to poop, and Goliath is no, I would like to return home, and also I would like to eat everything that is on the sidewalk, including this weird detritus. He never wants to move at your pace, so, like, Tinkerbell is appropriately walking ahead, and Goliath is like, I will go very slowly, and you will have to pull me the entire time.
Oh boy.
And then I get back inside, and I take his leash off, and he bites it, and he's like, no, I want to go back out. Sir?
Oh my god. Damn. Well, we have dogs. What can I say?
Teese, have you watched or read or partaken in the sweet nectar of any fun media this week?
No. I bought Pokemon Snap. And
Have
I
you
got
played
as
it
far
yet?
as... No. I got as far as putting the
No.
cartridge into my Switch and clicking on the icon, and then I had to do something.
It's really been one of those weeks for you, huh?
It really has been. But what about you? How are you?
I tore through something for next week's episode, which I'm very excited about.
Yes, I started reading that. Okay.
And then I read some things for this week's episode that I wish I had never seen. And I actually started... Okay, so the two big things that I've been, like, really into this week are I've been listening to a lot of Maintenance Phase, which is a podcast by Aubrey Gordon and Michael Hobbs about sort of, like, fat culture and everything that surrounds it. And it has been a very affirming and interesting podcast because, like, I never know where I fall in terms of, like, how I would label my body, because I think other people would call me fat, but I think people fatter than me would look at me and go, you're not fat.
I feel the same way about myself too. Yeah.
And so it is nice to listen to a podcast that really breaks down all of the super nefarious little tiny things that thread through, I'm going to say, American culture in general as it regards fatness and quote-unquote wellness. And it's just, like, it's super informative while also being lighthearted, and, like, I feel like I'm learning a lot, which is just an experience I really enjoy. And, like, Aubrey Gordon, who is, like, your fat friend online, like, that's the handle she uses, has such a delightful laugh that is so infectious, and I adore every time. And hearing about the wild, like, diet crazes and things pharma companies have gotten away with is just like, oh, it's mind-boggling. I started watching Invincible last night.
Oh, how is it?
It is not what I expected.
Okay.
It, like, I guess I expected more of, like, a slow ramp up with it. And I mean, the ending of the first episode, I was very immediately like, oh, okay, we're, like, fully going into this. But there were, like, already, like, peppered within the first episode these moments of, like, this man is not a good man. Like, he has just these short outbursts, and I'm like, okay, I don't... But I mean, John C. Reilly does a fantastic job. It's John C. Reilly, yes?
I'm not sure. I don't know.
The man who is the head of the paper in Spider-Man.
J. Jonah Jameson.
Yeah, the man who plays him. I think it's John C. Reilly, but yeah. He's a phenomenal voice actor. And so is Stephen Ewan. Robert Zemeckis' Joe... I forget that character's name already.
Is it J.K. Simmons?
J.K. Simmons, yes! Who's John C. Reilly? John C. Reilly is the comedian, isn't he?
Step Brothers. Oh my god.
I have this thing where if actors have, like, a similar amount of consonants or a rhythm to their name, I will mix them up. So, like, John C. Reilly, J.K. Simmons, right? It's, like, 3 parts. I do the same thing with Bryce Dallas Howard and Evan Rachel Wood, where I constantly mix their names up. They look nothing alike. They don't do work that overlaps. And yet...
If it makes you feel better, I always confuse Hugh Jackman and Gene Hackman together.
This is a throwback to my John and Joan Cusack beef.
Yeah.
How dare you? How dare you, Cusack family? I do think it's fitting, though, that we're talking a little bit about actors right now.
Oh,
because
why?
Teese, would you like to know what our topic is this week?
I already know what it is, but tell me so we can tell the listeners.
We're talking about real people fiction.
Oh.
So, before we even dive into this, Teese, what is your... Like, before I get started, before we talk about anything that's happened within this
subgenre of fandom, right?
Yeah.
What is your viewing from the outside opinion on real people fiction / fan fiction?
I can't even talk shit because I've read it before.
Okay.
But
We both have for the podcast.
We both have for the podcast, but I've also read it 2 other times before.
Okay.
Once in high school on the request of a friend, and then once because I was so baffled by the concept of a fic that I had to read it. And then, of course, I've read the iconic, original, Alpha Beta Omega fic.
Before we get really into, like, the meat of all the happenings surrounding RPF within fandom, we obviously never want to make fun of or other people for their interest in something. But I do think, or rather I think, not but, I think that RPF is a really interesting aspect of a lot of fandom that we don't talk about. And I think a lot of that comes from, shaming for various reasons, some legitimate, some, a little far-fetched, or, I don't think people want to take the step to really kind of examine where their boundaries are when it comes to their engagement in fandom, and, that's okay. But I think it's a conversation worth having. We are going to be doing more of a flyover of real person fan fiction and real person fiction as opposed to, like, a super deep dive into any specific fandom, because every fandom has their own culture surrounding RPF, and some fandoms are built entirely on RPF. So if you're really interested in, like, any one of these or, like, a specific story, like, reach out and let us know, because we would love to come back and explore this. But I want to kind of start a conversation about, just the essence of RPF, if you will, and the root form of it. So a lot of the information I'm drawing is from Fanlore. Thank you, Fanlore. There is so much that I would not know without you, and it is a phenomenal resource. RPF, just to, like, lay out the definition, is the shortened form of real person fiction or real people fiction. RPF chooses to make its topics about real, be they existing or past people, as opposed to fictional characters. So, writing about Chris Evans instead of writing about, Marvel movie Captain America / Steve Rogers. And according to Fanlore, RPF has been around since at least the 1960s. But it's actually, Fanlore's, number there is largely coming from fandom experiences and not the actual origin of real person fiction, which goes back probably as far as recorded human history.
I was going to say, wasn't there a time period, like, during Napoleon's time where people would actually sell paintings of Napoleon kissing other generals and rulers and stuff like that he currently was in the process of conquering or feuding with at the time and stuff like that?
That is delightful, and I do not know about that, but we're going to go back even further than that.
Wow. I was going to say, because, like, sometimes I think about how I just want to own, like, the world's most god-awful art, and I really want art of Napoleon kissing somebody, like, just a good vintage, I might be making that up, like, somewhere in the back of my mind. If any historians know about that, please.
Tease, your family is full of art historians.
It's fucking, like, Pompeii and shit. They're bitch-ass Italians. Like, they only know about, like, that part of Europe. They don't know anything about France. They probably do, but I think I would be mortified if I asked them, because then my mom would have to translate for me because I don't know Italian. So I'm not going to ask my mom that to ask my family that.
So RPF has, in fandom spaces, been around likely since the 1960s and has grown right alongside its counterparts in fandom, though a lot of that growth has been very much underground. RPF, I'm going to use largely as the more inclusive term here, because the other term is RPS, which stands for real person /, which is used in the context of slash pairings or shipping. So RPS is always going to be a part of RPF, but RPF does not always include shipping or pairings or what have you.
So, same way square is a rectangle, but a rectangle isn't always a square.
Correct.
Ah.
Yeah. And there are so many different terms, and they have evolved throughout time, and like will continue to evolve throughout time. But like real person fiction / real people fiction is just kind of the overall term we can use here. Early aughts fandoms use terms such as boy band / pop / and band / but those terms kind of fell by the wayside and have since been adopted under the greater RPF umbrella on Archive of Our Own. So like things like My Chemical Romance might have had like a specific name, or it might have just fallen under like boy band / or like band / bandom. Bandom is like a very popular term, yeah. Fun fact that I found out is that Japanese doujinshi creators call RPS namomono, which means raw food.
Wow.
Which is interesting to think about because like there is like, granted I'm not Japanese, I don't speak Japanese, but like from an outside perspective, when I hear that term, there's something really fascinating to me about the etymology of that, where it's like, yeah, the actor is in a way sort of like the raw material that creates the character in a lot of fashions.
Yeah.
I get where it's coming from, you know?
It's the way that they portray the character.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the life
which is
put in.
part of the argument we're going to talk about later that comes up with some of these. So, actor fic is also a really popular term that got used throughout the 90s and the aughts, and was often specifically used to talk about fan fiction about television and film actors.
Okay.
But I've personally noticed that more so lately when people use the term actor fic, they're referring to alternate universes involving fictional characters being actors.
Okay.
So like an alternate universe where like Turtle Creek, which we talked about in, you know, the It episode of Richie Tozier, like Turtle Creek could be considered like an actor fic because the characters are actors in it, you know? But it's not a real person fan fiction. RPF, or real person fiction, has pretty much always existed. Homer wrote RPF, Shakespeare wrote RPF, Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote RPF. Real person fiction as a term does not necessarily mean real person fan fiction. I want to take a moment to step a little to the left here to talk about something that I think is tangentially related to this and important to talk about. I'm going to read a quote from Tumblr user Ace Galahads, who says, "Fanfic is a modern concept that can only exist under capitalism and relies on copyright and the concept of intellectual property to exist. Authors from centuries ago using characters that didn't originate with them isn't fanfic, especially if it's tied to religious beliefs that simply evolved over time, or if they're using them to make a point about society. Arthurian literature isn't fanfic, the Divine Comedy isn't fanfic, Greco-Roman mythology isn't fanfic." I think there is an impulse of a lot of people, and like a lot of it is meant in jest and good fun, but I do think it is important that we take a step back and stop referring to, you know, Michelangelo's paintings as biblical fan fiction, because there is a distinct difference between like canonized works, right, and things which are homogenized into the cultural consciousness versus the derivative nature of works. And I have seen more and more this push of people talking about how traditional folklore is just fan fiction, and it's like, no, it's
fan
not. Fan
fiction of what? Fan fiction of what?
Fan fiction of existing concepts, and it's like
it's original content. Quite literally,
the
just
oral
been passed
traditions
down.
of people to pass things down, right, and like adapt them and make them more relevant. That's not fan fiction. That's a natural evolution of storytelling.
That's just a retelling. There's literal terms for it.
And I like, when I say all this, I think the gut reaction, right, is like people are like, oh, you're being really reductive of fanfiction. That's not the intent. And I don't mean to diminish or reduce the importance of fan works, but instead highlight the very clear difference between these things. Folklore is canon within its communities, and when I talk about folklore, that also includes religious works. And while there may be arguments to fanfiction being akin to or similar to folklore, its presentations, context, and distributions do make it inherently different. And so, yes, it is all like good fun to say like, oh, you know, it's just Bible fan fiction or it's just Bible fan art. And it's like, yeah, but you also need to understand that, like, there's a reason we talk about things being canon literature. I want to take a step back then, again, towards our main topic of real person fiction, you know, with the understanding that, like, Homer wasn't writing fan fiction about like Odysseus or the Greek gods or stuff. Like, no, that's canon lore and literature, and canonization is not an exclusive term to fandom, which I think some people who are like very online might not realize. Canon is not a term that originated within fandom, and it has existed long before. But it does then make me sit and, like, because Song of Achilles is relevant now, is like, is Song of Achilles published fanfiction? No, it's not. It's a retelling. There's a difference. Because Song of Achilles is, again, it comes back to this root, right, of, like, fan fiction depends on the existence of copyright and intellectual property. And I could talk about this topic for hours, because it's just so fascinating to me, like, the very fine nuance. So, the entire genre of historical fiction frequently revolves around real people, or it interlaces their cameos and mentions throughout the story. I don't remember what the series was called, but I do recall that there was, like, a series growing up of books that were, like, all about sports with historical fiction of, like, a young boy going back in time to discover the origin of sports and, like,
Not Percy
meeting
Jackson.
the men who came up with them.
That sounds... No. Not me. God, no. I would never read that.
Sports books in this household?
Listen, I was too afraid to read Goosebumps. I was strictly a Pony Pals, Magic Treehouse, and there was a dolphin book series. What the fuck was that called? I don't even know, but I was a big dolphin girl.
I've never considered the existence of fandom and fan creator spaces for, like, children's literature like that, and I would be fascinated to know what those communities are like.
Panda and Warrior Cat.
No. Don't open that door. Don't open that cat door. Panda will charge through.
Shout out to Panda, our once a while audio editor.
Panda pounding their paws on the desk. Let me in. Let me in.
Huge Warrior Cats fan.
Teese, can you think of a prominent woman in Western literature canon? Maybe a group of sisters who have largely influenced the literary scene.
The Brontes.
Yeah, so fun fact I learned about the Brontes is that they actually liked to roleplay as the Duke of Wellington and his sons and, like, invent whole stories around that.
Oh my god.
So it's like, it's really fascinating when I was digging through all of this to find out how many huge figures in our Western literary canon engaged with, you know, just, like, real person fiction and who were really fascinated by it. My favorite book is a historical fiction book about Alexander the Great, which is technically real person slash. It's The Persian Boy, and it is a phenomenal book. It's absolutely beautiful.
It is,
but
good.
It's real person slash.
It sure is. It sure is, and I love it. It's good. I never finished it, but it's good.
I'm buying so many books at a rate at which I cannot read them all, but I do want to really go back and reread that one because it is so beautiful.
I got about 50 pages in. I was reading it on a road trip, but I want to get back to it. Yeah.
I found it because a woman in front of me on a long bus trip was reading it, and she was driving me absolutely nuts because she was, like, really rude, and she, like, would recline her seat back and, like, give me all these dirty looks. And I was like, I bet the book you're reading is shit. And then I picked it up, and it ended up being one of my favorite books.
And now you have a big ass tattoo.
I have a big ass Alexander the Great tattoo. Love that boy. Which, you know what? Doing this episode, it made me question some things about putting another human being's face on my body without their consent.
A dead man.
The thing with historical fiction, right, is that, like, even if the events being recounted are known and they're recorded and we know they happened, it's still technically real person fiction on some level. Like, even if you are doing, like, the driest possible liturgical analysis, right, of, like, somebody's life, human beings are going to, in even the slightest ways, fictionalize that. And, like, especially, like, you know, in memoirs, there is a heady little mix of, like, real person fiction. There is, like, a little kernel of it in the way we just naturally fictionalize our own lives. Interesting, and, you know, predictably enough, when humans are involved in anything, sex gets involved. So, Teese, would you like to read this passage from Fanlore on the published works of celebrity erotica for me?
I would love to. Commercial works depicting famous people in sexual situations are fairly common, especially in purported memoirs such as Casanova's Story of My Life. Tijuana Bibles were pornographic, unauthorized comic books featuring celebrities published in USA between 1920s and the 1960s. Paul Krasner's 1964 surreal fantasy of Lyndon Johnson molesting JFK's dead body and another example of the genre, one that uses the famous to create a shock effect. In 2000, the horror writer Poppy Z. Bright published Plastic Jesus, a thinly disguised alternate universe in which John Lennon and Paul McCartney fall in love and come out as gay. Starfucker is a 2001 anthology in which Carol Queen does Marilyn Monroe, Bill Brunt does Elvis, Cecilia Tan does Ziggy Stardust, Michelle T does Motley Crue. All of them. M. Christian does Whoopi Goldberg, and Susie Bright does Dan Quayle. In 2006, Fick Press began publishing collections of fan-written stories about musicians and their sex lives in trade paperback format.
Thoughts and feelings?
JFK, his body, was so fucked up. He was hopped up on so many meds. And you make LBJ, a man who hated JFK, touch his body. How dare you?
For shock factor.
For shock fiction. For shock fiction, how could you? How could you? Our American president, John F. Kennedy, a man who loved his wife's fat ass and loved Marilyn Monroe more. How could you do this to him? Nah, fuck the Kennedys. Anyway. Damn.
Sandy Passage, baby.
Hey, yo. Anyway.
Hey, yo, big Sandy Passage fans.
I don't even... What is Sandy Passage?
Sandy Passage is the documentary now parody of Grey Gardens.
Oh, I was gonna say, is that your documentary now?
Yeah, I mean, documentary now, I mean, like, when you have parody work, right? Like, even if it's parody, it's real person fiction. And the thing that was, like, so startling to me about doing this research, right, was the overlapping of concepts which I didn't think touched. And I feel like in fandom, there has been this regard for people who engage in, like, real person shipping with a lot of malice and anger and frustration and shame. And, like, in many cases, of my own opinion, for valid reasons. But to find out that this has, like, always been such a part of, like, especially American culture, of, like, just robbing celebrities of any sense of privacy to write about them and publish it so that it is so very much above ground, really surprised me. In the 1930s and 40s, Whitman Publishing actually frequently published novels and serials of signed actors like Judy Garland in fictional adventures. So, like, this has historical precedent. And in the 60s and 70s, teen magazines sometimes did similar things, working with celebrities themselves through agents and publicists to spin romantic or perilous stories that they would publish. Blogger Mike Sterling shared a story from his own collection in which, quote, a girl named Cindy and Donny Osmond are involved in a scenario with hypothermia and huddling for warmth that fanish readers might see as hurt comfort.
Wow.
Like, these things existed, and, like, publishing companies and publicists clearly understood that there was a desire for people to fuel these fantasies and, like, have these little lives with celebrities. But I think that, you know, oversteps a boundary. One of the, like, Teese, can you think of a movie about a now very prominent billionaire which featured a score from Trent Reznor? I can list some of the actors in it if that'll
I know
help.
what movie you're talking
What
about.
movie are we talking about?
The Social Network.
The Social Network and the book it's based on, which we're going to come back to a little bit later, I think is a phenomenal modern example of like our obsession with real person fiction and the invasiveness we have in celebrities' lives.
Mm-hmm. Don't you think that there's also this aspect of, due to social media, we suddenly have these pictures into celebrities' lives?
Oh,
And,
absolutely.
like, for instance, I always think about streamer fan fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Like, especially the Game Grumps and Polygrumps and stuff like that. And with Minecraft streamers, and how there was a rumor that the reason why AO3 shut down like a few months ago was because a really popular dream, the Minecraft streamer Fick, happened, updated, and people swarmed to it in droves, which then kind of made the servers go down on AO3. But that's apparently bullshit. That was a lie. But it just kind of happened within the same day for just different reasons. And like, maybe the reason why we have so much more fan fiction for real people at this time is because we have parasocial relationships, and we feel like we know bits and pieces about them, and we find ourselves thinking about these people in ways that we think about characters, because it's like, yes, we have a relationship the same way that we have a relationship with a character, or yes, we have this relationship the same way that you would make a goofy story about your friends. Like my senior year of high school, this girl who I'm now realizing may have had a crush on me
Teese is having realizations in real time.
This girl who, incredibly sweet, I always, like, I know she still lives around town, I always hope I bump into her because she was really cool. The last week of school actually handed me, like, almost like a fan fiction, essentially, of a handful of people that was in our mythology class, and it was us in the Psychonauts universe, because I was one of the few people who also played Psychonauts that she knew, and she was just so excited. And like, I know, it's like so sweet. I think I still have it. It was such a sweet gift. Like, I was so genuinely touched that she gave it to me too. And I am now realizing on screen, but
yeah, it was like really weird. Like ourselves kissed in the fic, and
no,
like
we didn't kiss. We were just like hanging out, like in Psychonauts, you know. But I think when you write stories about you and your friends like this, or you have dreams about you and your friends like this, and then you have this parasocial relationship with these streamers and these actors, and you're like, but they're my friend too. I watch them on YouTube. You're gonna end up writing situations about them, and then sometimes those situations, because they're half your friend, half a character in your mind, you suddenly write sexual situations about them, you know. And oh god, social media has done awful things to us.
Yeah, and I mean we're gonna talk about that because there was a shift from RPF in fandom spaces being very much underground, and I think now it has really become more visible and more apparent, and we'll talk a little bit about, you know, reasons why that may be. When we see fanish communities really start to establish themselves through the 20th century and move from mailing lists to or mailing lists and physical zines to also hosting online within forums and email lists, we start to see more debate crop up around RPF because people are communicating more easily, you know? And we're going to jump back and forth a little in time to deliver kind of broad concepts and then sort of zero in on stuff. So just, you know, prepare yourself for that. There's going to be a lot of jumping between the 90s and the aughts and such. Much of the debate around RPF in fandom really seems to specifically stem from Slash. I think for understandable reasons, because you are not, you know, writing about Mark Hamill on the set of Star Wars talking to Muppets, which seems, you know, pretty innocuous and gentle. You're now writing about the very personal and private interactions of real existing people. And that's a little bit when it kind of gets uncomfortable for people, and understandably so. Every person, you know, is going to have different boundaries and lines they draw for themselves in fandom, and some people aren't comfortable with RPF no matter how public a persona is. And I think it's interesting too, the dichotomy, right, of a person who is not comfortable with RPF in fandom spaces versus a person who is like comfortable with it in the sense of like actual published works. So, you know, people who find like political cartoons and parodies to be really interesting, but who would, you know, absolutely balk at it in fan fiction, or like me even, who's like kind of about, you know, the portrayal of real people in fan fiction. I'm like very no thank you on that. But again, my favorite book is about a person who was real and is dead, you know? Or the enjoyment we all got out of Hamilton, and like the conversations that then cropped up around that about, you know, woobifying a dead man or a slave owner or sexualizing a slave owner, and like those levels to it, right? It's an incredibly personal boundary that everybody draws for themselves, and I think it's just like an interesting thing to examine, you know? And I can understand why you would be more okay with it in a published context versus a fan context, because like published work almost has to go through a series of filters, you know, where it's like a bunch of people had to look at this. That doesn't mean that everything that gets published is, you know, great or perfect or maybe done with the best of intentions, certainly. But I think there's another level of separation that happens there for people. I used the word persona earlier when talking about, you know, the level of publicity people have, and I think the word persona is really important. And I want to take a moment to talk about that because I see a lot of people bolstering their arguments in favor of RPF fandom because of the public facing personas of a celebrity, and how they take that and say, well, like, that's a character that they play. And that public facing persona of the celebrity must be an entirely detached entity, or it's so curated it may as well be a character. I think that's incredibly naive. And it can also then open the door into debating the invasiveness of fan works in general. Especially if someone views even fictional characters then as facets of the creator. Because like if you're making the argument, right, that like a wrestler has their, you know, in-ring persona and it's totally cool to write about that character, it's like, well, but that's still a facet of who that wrestler is as a performer, you know? And like you're still writing about them in sexual scenarios. And that's fine. But then there's also the debate then of like, okay, let's take the example of Captain America again. Granted, Chris Evans did not write Steve Rogers. But you start to talk about how an actor portrays a character and gives life to them and creates a lot of mannerisms with them. There's like a level of debate there. And, you know, I would like to imagine there's good faith debate, but I think we can always understand that it's the internet and there is not always, you know, good faith conversations happening.
I know sometimes when actors work together on one series or movie, then they'll end up working together again. Like, for instance, Charlie Day and Vern Gorman in
Yup.
Pacific Rim, and how they work together on Pacific Rim, and then Vern Gorman shows up in a It's Always Sunny episode. And that fuels, like, kind of a Pepe Silva string theory situation, you know, where it's like, oh, these actors are working together. Oh, they're and in turn it becomes like this. It's a snowball effect at the end of the day, especially with actors and how to go back to Steve Rogers, there's a certain way that Chris Evans portrays him, which then becomes the consciousness of how we view and portray that character in our minds.
Exactly.
And the two become like synonymous with each other. You know, it's not like it blends when we write fan fiction about actors who portray characters and then these actors associating with each other as people instead of as characters. It just continues to blend a certain mindset. I don't even know, man. It's there's so much psychological stuff to unpack with RPF.
Well, I mean, to diverge even further, like, let's go back to the very first ABO fic. I'm blanking on the title of it right now, but, like, the
I ain't no
mannerisms.
lady, but you'd be the tramp? Is that what
Yeah,
it is?
but the
Something?
mannerisms of Jensen Ackles and Jared Padalecki in that fic are informed by their behavior as characters in Supernatural. And
Yeah.
it almost brings up this question of like, why didn't you just write about Dean and Sam? You instead chose to write about the actors. But I mean, yeah, because then it gets more taboo because you add in the tag of incest, right? Yeah, there's something that's really interesting that'll happen there. And again, like, it's another point that we're going to come back to later in the episode. I think, too, K-pop is really important to talk about, or, predating K-pop was something that might be more accessible to quote-unquote fandom olds, is, like, the personas of rock stars of, like, Kiss and Daft Punk, especially in the case of K-pop, where idols are frequently forced to hide their personal lives because of fan entitlement. Idols are being marketed as the people that they are. And there is an expectation and desire of celebrities to share a life which is already so invaded by publicity and public interest. And then it is mercilessly picked apart and analyzed despite ever having the greater context of that person's intimate life. And, like, the phenomena of celebrity is inherently abusive. It is. It is incredibly invasive. There's no arguing about it. And, like, for me, I don't mean to shame anyone, but for me personally, that is, like, the part of real person fiction that, like, does make me the most uncomfortable, is the assumption of these very real people, many of whom are still alive, and it's just another level of invasiveness.
There's also, like, a fantasy to it as well. Like, for instance, with the concept of Daft Punk fic, sometimes it's the actual musicians themselves as humans taking off the suit, but sometimes it's, like, straight up robot porn, you know?
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, you and I both know that these are people behind the suits.
No,
Like,
they're real robots.
apparently so. And
They're real robots.
They're plugging in shit into each other, you know? Like, just read Transformers fanfiction, dude. Like, just read Transformers fic. I mean, once again, I guess, like, I'm not going to shame you for reading Daft Punk fic. Like, I'm not perfect. Read awful shit. I've written awful shit. But, like, I just, it's, once again, like I was saying, it's this very weird line that's blurred, and it's this kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? But, like, the demand that because I'm a fan of yours, I own you in a way. You know, it's the fantasy of it all. The fantasy.
Yeah.
The illusion.
Yeah. And I mean, we're only talking right now about these quote-unquote personas, these actors, these very real people interacting with each other. We haven't even gotten to the part about self-inserts with these. Some people, and a huge concern in a lot of fandom spaces for a very long time, is that real person fiction, especially erotic works, could potentially be classable as libel.
Interesting.
I would like to tell you the tale of a show called Forever Knight.
Okay.
Forever Knight, which is spelled like Knight in Shining Armor, Knight, was a TV drama that ran from 1992 to 1996. It was a Canadian show, and it was a remake of a 1989 TV movie called Nick Knight, which, terrible name. Great job on the rebrand. Forever Knight follows Nick, who is an 800-year-old vampire working as a detective with the Toronto Police Department. And this is totally unrelated, but the vampire who made Nick and his, like, vampire spawn sibling Janet is named LaCroix. And that was my favorite discovery when I was researching. LaCroix the vampire. Nearly a millennia old, and you're named LaCroix. Can you imagine being like this immortal, all-powerful being, and then
he's the one who made LaCroix. He's the one responsible for flavored seltzer. That's how he made his million.
It's not flavored. It's essenced.
It's good. That's what it is.
Is it? Is
Yes.
it good, Teese?
I love LaCroix. Shut the fuck up. I love LaCroix.
So, at this time, right, you're talking about the 90s, RPF was still, in fandom spaces, largely kept underground because of the fear of possible prosecution or accusations of libel or general morality policing when you have, like, people going after each other and shaming each other. A mid-1990s piece of Forever Knight fanfiction may have also contributed to that continued subversion and staying underground because Tori Spelling was offended by the mention and inclusion of herself in a fic that was for the Forever Knight fandom. I went and looked. Tori Spelling never actually was, like, on the show from what I could find. So, like, she was just kind of pulled in for one reason or another. And she threatened to sue Penn State University, which hosted the Forever Knight mailing list. The lawsuit was averted, but in its place, the Penn State University servers drew up rules that forbid the inclusion of real people unless they got specific written permission by the person in question. You literally had to get a signed permission slip from a celebrity or anyone else if you wanted to include them in your fanfiction if it was being hosted on one of these servers.
That's so funny. Oh my god. Oh my god.
Tori Spelling your impact.
Wow.
But, like, that permission slip thing also kind of came about because, like, people were including, like, other members of the community in their fan fictions, whether that be for, like, gift fic or, like, as a joke, without those persons' knowledge and, like, understand, like, Teese, if I went and wrote, like, erotica about you fucking a fictional character and, like, didn't tell you about it and then, like, publicly shared it across a mailing list, like, I would imagine you'd feel kind of violated.
You know, if you were to be like, Teese, I wrote self-insert fic about you, fucking XYZ character, here, read it. I probably would think it's hilarious.
But if I didn't even share it
But
with
if you
first
didn't
and,
share
like,
it with me-
publicized it...
Friendship over with Caspian lore. Now, Eskel is my new best friend.
Eskel is the new podcast co-host. Where is he? A lot of new lists popped up after this whole, like, little altercation that then forbid any presence of RPF on them, thus keeping that branch of fan culture largely underground for many more years. Because, like, not only do you have, you know, the morality police on your tail, you now have the servers just overall saying, like, you're not allowed here because, like, there's possible potential for litigation, you know, if an actor finds out or finds this unfavorable. And I mean, like, I don't know in what context Tori Spelling was featured in that fic, but, like, again, you can imagine if there's, like, a real living person who's, like, trying to get their career off the ground and suddenly they're, like, the most synonymous thing with their name is, like, some weird fandom erotica that includes them, like, that's maybe not gonna look great, you know?
Tori Spelling's dad was an insanely popular director, if I recall correctly. So, like, Tori Spelling has always been in the eye of society as a whole. So
Yeah.
I think it's just like, once again, people, because she's always been there, just assume that they can use her as an object. And this is why worshipping celebrities is bad.
Yes. This is why celebrity culture is bad, you know?
Yeah.
And I mean, like, I can't fault Tori Spelling for, as a person who, like, is
Not at
just a
all.
public persona and, you know, has to control the image and the presence she has, like, for wanting to take this shit down and, like, get rid of it, you know, in whatever context it was. Because, like, her image is who the public sees her as. Like, you would want to control that. You want to control the vision of yourself that other people see. And celebrities oftentimes, like, don't have a lot of control over that. People catch them in, like, their most private moments or invade those moments and, you know, just, like, blast it out to everyone. In 1987, a Star Trek The Original Series zine called Shadows in the Rain included a real person / fic. And a fan shared the following response. Teese, would you like to read this for me?
Yes, I would. The most disturbing thing about Shadows in the Rain is that it encourages a basic tendency in fans to forget the separation between the character and the actor. I realize that this particular story emphasizes separation, yet at the same time it undercuts our ability to keep Leonard Nimoy separate from Spock by bringing him into a KS fantasy. If it is permissible to include Nimoy in a piece of KS fiction, then why not Shatner? Why not both of them together? In fact, what's to stop the next writer from coming up with a Shatner Nimoy story, totally violating the separation between fantasy and reality in Kirk Spock, KS? We may be sliding down a slippery slope here. There is a definite ethical distinction between fantasizing about fictional characters and fantasizing about real people. The first is harmless, the second may be hurtful in many ways. It is important to understand where Shadows in the Rain could take us. In that direction lies a Kirk Spock that is neither moral nor sane.
What are your feelings about that argument?
You know, I'm still trying to
You're still reeling from learning how to pronounce Leonard Nimoy, huh?
Yeah, I am. But I mean, there's a point.
Mm-hmm.
There's a point. This person clearly respects the actors very deeply, and they don't want to objectify the actors.
Mm-hmm.
Was this a throuple fic? Like,
I don't know the personal context of this fic. I think like you bring up an interesting point there with objectifying the actors, because like if you're objectifying the characters of Spock and Kirk, though, you are objectifying the bodies of Leonard Nimoy and William Shatner.
Yes, you are.
And I don't think that very rapid jump here to calling engagement with real person fiction and / insane at the end of this person's quote is at all productive. I think that's very black and white thinking, you know, which doesn't help in this conversation as much as I think this person intends for it to. It does bring up, however, the importance of the distinction between actor and character, that entitlement to privacy, and the invasive nature and lacking of consent when, you know, you're writing real person fiction. Pop slash, which is a subgenre of real person fiction focusing on NSYNC and the Backstreet Boys, brought real person fiction to more prominence and visibility. And this is the point in my research where I got pulled into a slimy hole reading a 1987 George Michael / self-insert fic that had me screaming and also doing text-to-speech in like every Discord channel I was in to have it scream slimy hole at people. Because unless you're talking about a goo monster or a slime person, I don't ever want to see you describing somebody's anus as their slimy hole. Repugnant. I'm shaming you. I'm shaming that one person in particular.
That's so gross.
Teese, there's a link there if you ever want to read that fic.
I don't. Also, is it gay George Michael self-insert?
Yeah, it's gay. It's gay.
Thank God. Okay, cool. At least somebody respects his sexuality.
It was like, admittedly by this person, they were writing their own sexual fantasy. I come from a perspective where I am like deeply uncomfortable sexually fantasizing about actual real celebrities. Like, that makes me super uncomfortable. I'm not a person with like a lot of sexual fantasies, I guess, but like that makes me really uncomfortable. But like that is also like a normal and healthy thing that a lot of people do and engage with, and like I'm not here to shame your sexual fantasy that you are pursuing in your own brain. But I think you need to be careful about if and when you ever share that on the internet. Fanfictionnet, which was the largest archive of fanworks at the time, actually removed all real person fiction in 2002. Actor fic had previously been banned, but other forms of RPF had sort of skirted under in the way like everything does on fanfictionnet, where they're like, no 18 plus or erotic situations. It's like, oh, okay, sure, FF. In 2012, for Fanfiction Oral History, Cynthia Jenkins talked about how internet changed fandom and said, I think that there was a sense that everything was out of control and that none of the assumptions that had come to be central to culture could be taken for granted anymore. One key example here would be real person Fick, because for a long time, I guess growing out of conversations like those with the actors in the mid 80s, there was a very clear sense amongst the fandom we're writing about the characters, we're not writing about the actors. RPF existed, but it was underground and it was acknowledged as a little transgressive because you were really crossing a line there. And people enjoyed crossing that line maybe, but they still would pass the stories to their friends. They didn't publish them in zines. There was an assumption that there was a line. When everything slam dunked the internet, that assumption went out the window. And suddenly, people were writing stories about real actors as if they were characters with no sense that there could be a line. And I think, say, the old members of the community were looking in horror and thinking, oh my god, they don't understand. I think that's a really great encapsulation of just like the nature of how fandom has changed in general. And I think we talked a little bit about it in our episode on like good practices for younger people online, but like the way young people, younger than us at least, interact with others on the internet and how they interact with the internet in general is like sometimes very horrifying to us. And like I think a lot of that is because there just isn't like, we have social rules on the internet, but they aren't posted anywhere. Like, you just kind of learn them through doing. And when there are millions and millions and millions of people coming onto the internet totally new every day, like, those rules are a lot harder to kind of quote unquote uphold because, like, there's such a saturation that these people can't possibly learn it. And, like, the rules of the internet are changing day by day, and they're different amongst your friend groups. So like what we would consider totally appropriate between us as behaviorist friends, Teese, is like totally unacceptable for some other people. And like, I mean, just in like, I'm thinking about like my Final Fantasy 14 server that I'm on, where it's like we're all like really relaxed about spoilers, like nobody really cares. But like there are some places where it's like you don't even post a still screenshot of a location of a place without tagging it as spoilers, because like that random field is a spoiler. And it's like, okay.
If somebody were to send me a person eating Taco Bell in their shower, and if it wasn't you, get away from me. Blocked. Blocked. Unless you personally have received a photo of me in the shower drinking a beer or a canned coffee, you are blocked on site.
I think like a lot of the lack of rules and the lack of like social structures on the internet is in large part to the way the platforms that we use have changed. Like Twitter doesn't have a tagging system. It doesn't have a good way to filter things. Tumblr had an okay tagging system, and like, like you would even find in like different communities of Tumblr where it's like it's okay to have a conversation in the reblogs versus people who are like, you absolutely don't add anything onto a post, you put it in the tags, like just like those weird separations. And like before, the internet has just become so reduced and streamlined, and it's like every new social media platform is like, let's carve away a bunch of features that the old one had, and it's like, stop. Those were there for a reason, and I liked them. And, like, I saw a post on Tumblr a few weeks ago that has stuck with me, talking about this effect that Tumblr has where you think you're all engaging in the same conversation underneath a reblog, right? But in essence, what can actually happen is that two people can see the same post, but that post can have wildly different conversations happening underneath it. Because Tumblr doesn't organize and collate them all together. It is like, it's a bunch of branching paths where they all become farther and farther removed from the original source.
Have you ever had a popular text post on Tumblr.com?
Yes.
Yeah. It's not
hell.
fun. It's hell.
It's hell.
Fucking hell. I hate it.
You see the same argument happen like 300 different times, and none of them are interconnected with each other.
Or the same joke. I'm sorry, I'm mean. I don't care.
It was.
Don't make me tap the sign. Untag me in your replies.
It was LiveJournal, which allowed for real person fanfiction to curate more of its own independent communities. Because, as always, LiveJournal was the peak of the internet, and we'll never get back there. Prior to LiveJournal, the main methods of fanfic sharing and distribution were, through lists and interconnected sites like email lists, zine lists, mailing lists, etc. But LiveJournal really allowed for this, you could find your community and curate it privately in a way that, lists and interconnected sites and forums didn't really allow as much. You could be a little bit more private. And because real person fiction was often more taboo, less prominent, less mainstream, it tended to be shuffled more toward rare pair archives.
Mm-hmm.
A discussion began on Rare/, which was a website, on January 17th, 2000, about real person fiction and rationalizing it. The owner of Rare/ list on the 24th announced, "I will from now on allow real people / on the list if and only if it is properly labeled," which, seems fair, that way people can at least screen it out, There's not the complex tagging systems that we have today where you're able to filter things, but, you are at least able to see, it's got real person / on it, I don't want to read this. Massive discussion blows up. Multiple people threaten to leave the list. 2 days later, on the 26th of January 2000, Rare/X is created. This list is a spin-off of Rare/, which allows real person fiction and real person /. And this was the first large moment of real person / being explicitly acknowledged and hosted in front of people who weren't actively seeking it out, which inevitably meant more discussion on the morality and ethics of real person fiction abounded.
Okay.
Side note, The Social Network, which released in 2010 and whose book The Accidental Billionaires released in 2009, was an interesting interlock of real person fiction and more traditional fan experiences. Because if you read Accidental Billionaires, right, it is collected from hundreds of different sources of different things that people have said, and the author acknowledges, look, I did my best, but we have to acknowledge that because of the way that this is all collected, there's a large aspect to it that it's fictionalized, we can try our damnedest to give the whole truth, but, there's Mark Zuckerberg's truth, right? There's the twins' truth. There's, I forget, Andrew Garfield's
twins. That's a really big issue within music history as well. It's do you print the legend or do you print the thing that you were able to piece together,
Mm-hmm.
Same idea.
Exactly.
It's, people can tell you different stories. People, especially with music, who was fucked up on drugs, how many years ago was it, there's
people
never...
can tell you a different story 2 years apart, 2
literally,
days apart.
Literally, yeah, no, and we can never truly be certain unless it's physically been recorded in some way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm.
So
our perception is our reality and our truth, and our perception is ultimately altered by all of our circumstances and contexts.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But when we talk about, The Social Network, the movie, the actors provide a separation from the real people, which further helped to canonize them less as real people and more as fictional. I have seen fan art for The Social Network, and it's people doing fan art don't regard it as doing fan art of the real Mark Zuckerberg. They're no, this is, Jesse Eisenberg's character in a movie. And it's interesting, but no.
Great choice,
yes.
I guess.
I mean, and it's I can't really argue with them because yeah, that is a portrayal of events that happened in some form or fashion. Definitely not on that level of drama, but I get it. I get the separation there, and the characters to be portrayed and adapted by actors. That is a whole other level of separation, and the veil between the reality of the people and the fiction of the characters, it becomes thicker and more opaque, even if to me that's only marginal, Yeah. And you had people who were just fans of Andrew Garfield and Jesse Eisenberg who wanted to draw fan art of them, and maybe make them kiss. And it's like, it's not like they want Jesse Eisenberg and Andrew Garfield to kiss necessarily, but they want them to kiss in this context. It's just really interesting. And I don't think that there is like a concrete, this is a bad thing you did or this is a good thing you did. I think that like it's a really complex, tangled up issue.
Yeah.
Talking about characterization in RPF, that's when you get into a lot more of these like nitty gritty arguments in pro or against, right? And there are different beliefs about how much the real person could be affected by RPF based upon the characterization of their name and persona in the work. Most fans are of the opinion that real person fiction is about the persona and not the actual person. But the persona is still a groomed presentation of that person and is a reflection to the public of that person. So, like, even if, I think, like, a weird example of this is Trisha Paytas, who, granted, I don't know a ton about, but Trisha Paytas is known for, like, having all these different characters and personas she puts on to a degree where, like, people don't know who she really is. But I still don't think that makes it okay for people to say, like, oh, well, we have full authority to say whatever we want about that character because, like, that's not the real Trisha. And it's like, but you don't know that. Like, unless you have, like, the express permission of Trisha Paytas, who, like, is a, she's a human being. I'm gonna put it that way. I don't think that there are evil people or bad people. Trisha Paytas is just a human being. Somebody's gonna take that way out of context, but she's just a human being, and I think it's really weird, especially for people who have like never met her, never interacted with her, to say like it's totally fine for me to write, you know, about her because like that's not the real her. I'm not seeing, you know, like the actual Trisha Paytas. Like this is just a character. I think it's a weird argument. You know?
At the end of the day, like, if she still sees it, she's still gonna get upset by it if that is something that makes her uncomfortable, you know? Like...
But then there are people who argue, like, well, she'll never see it. And it's like, but that doesn't mean it's okay.
You'd be surprised.
But no, right? Like, okay, so she never sees it. That doesn't mean that, like, it's okay.
Yeah.
Like, just because a tree falls in a forest and you don't know about it doesn't mean that tree didn't fall and it didn't have impact on the surrounding ecosystem.
And it still made a sound, baby. It still makes a sound.
Some argue that the real person fiction characters are more fictional than actual fictional characters. I explicitly do not like this argument. This is a quote that is memorialized on fanlore from a user of the name Lobelia321 who wrote, "Real person/characters, by contrast, are total chimerae. They are wraiths, and not of the Stargate Atlantis variety. They are insubstantial, they are surface, they are the ultimate screens for our projections." I think, Lobelia321, that is a huge rationalization that, again, is super naive, and it robs the real person of actual agency. And other people, even if they are actors or entertainers by trade, are still people, and they do not exist for you to project on them. Their character in a film might, but they as human beings do not. Like, I don't care how much of a social commodity or product someone has been turned into. It is not okay for you to sit there and say, like, it's totally okay for me to project on them. First of all, that's not a great behavior to adopt into your life, of like projecting onto people and like trying to read between the lines of people. Like, you're just gonna wind up in a lot of hot shit doing that. Like, you're gonna find yourself in a lot of conflict, I think, because you need to rely and communicate to people that the method of communication is to communicate verbally. To be explicit, because like that's the only way you're gonna know the true intention of someone. If they're hiding something from you, that's on them, you know? And like they're hiding it from you for one reason or another, you know? Oh, that one really spiced me up in all this reading. Like, I didn't really get upset about any of this, but that got me like pretty upset.
No, I don't blame you, because it's like denying the damage that you're doing. Like, it's not gaslighting.
Excusing it too.
Yeah, it's not gaslighting, but it's just like, saying like, well, it's okay that I'm doing it because they're a
Mm-hmm.
celebrity and they chose to be in the public eye. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
shut the fuck up.
Well,
Ah!
and like even for the case of like people who aren't like big huge A-list celebrities, like talking about like any streamer, right? Like Germa, he's not consenting to you looking at him and being like, actually, I think he's gay based on this, and this behavior.
Germa's dick is big, and I'm gonna write about it. Like, no, stop. Leave Germa alone. He's just digging out dirt. Like,
He's just biting rocks in the desert.
I've never watched a single Germa video in
Neither
my
have
life.
I.
I love that for us.
There is an argument in all of this to be made, right, for how the physicality of real actors informs their fictional characters. And I think we have seen a lot of fans latching on to small physical nuances to enrich the presentation of a character in a fan fiction they're writing. And I think that's totally okay. Because, right, like, ostensibly, when an actor is portraying a character and that movie comes out, the actor has consented to that. You know, there is a contract written up. They have signed an agreement. There is consent happening in that exchange. Where there isn't consent happening is when the paparazzi are harassing people, or, you know, you are, you know, taking stealth photos of someone, or like reading second or third hand stories about how somebody acted in public and like sort of melding that into your canon idea of a real person and how they act. Again, though, that rationalization being used to excuse a more invasive assuming practice in real person fiction. And we can't pretend that RPF doesn't very much exist of non-actors, of streamers who aren't consenting to, you know, people writing about them or their small little habits or tics or what have you. And we're pretty exclusively focusing on fan fiction here, but there's a worthy conversation to be had about fan art, and especially pornographic fan art. I brought up Steve Rogers for a reason earlier because, like, I engaged with the Marvel fandom and especially Captain America, and, like, for me personally, there's a line I can't totally nail down about depicting the characters in erotic situations because of whether or not, like, the artwork is hyper real or it's stylized. Like, when that artwork is hyper realistic or looks like way too much like Chris Evans, I get uncomfortable with it. Like, I don't want to see it.
Blame you.
Because it's too apparent for me that there's not a lot of room for the separation of actor and character for me. I think another great example of this would actually be Connor Detroit. Because Connor uses Brian Deckert's actual likeness. So, like, more stylized fan art, like, I'm pretty comfortable with. Like, but when it's like hyper realistic pinups of Connor or like, you know, sexual situations, like that's when I start to get uncomfortable. Especially when people are then like putting that in Brian Deckert's face without him consenting to it. Like, I'm not going to name the artist in particular, but I was really personally bothered, and a lot of people in the Detroit Become Human fandom were bothered when a very popular artist made a dakimakura, i.e. a body pillow, of Connor Detroit, and she has a very realistic style, and it was a sexual pinup pillow, and she gave it to him in front of his wife, and she was like, oh no, it's totally okay, he loved it. And I'm like, he's trapped at a fan meeting, and if he responds negatively, that's gonna look really bad for him. Like, you are trapping him in it made me so uncomfortable. Like, you drew erotica of this person without their consent. And then
gave
you
it to
put
them
it in
as a
their
pillow,
face.
as if they want to actually have this.
And like, you know what? Regardless of what Brian Deckert's reaction is, whether it is positive or negative, I don't think it's an appropriate scenario. I don't think that that is an appropriate interaction. There's the power imbalance, right? Of like him being the actor, but then also just like somebody foisting this on him again in public without his consent, you know? There is
It'd be like, what if somebody on the subway just drew a picture of you naked and handed it to you? Like,
you'd be uncomfortable.
yeah. It's just, I get it. It's funny to think of these characters, but especially as like, please, just use common sense.
Well,
I'm never gonna knock somebody, but just use common sense. I am begging you, please.
But we all know about the fucking late night scenarios where late night hosts will have an actor on and then they'll like talk about the fan community and then they'll show them like erotic fan art and they always pick either the photo manipulations or the hyper realistic stuff. And I'm thinking specifically of an episode of Conan I watched a long time ago that had Tom Feltman on, and Conan was like, "Oh yeah, look at this fan art of like Draco and Harry getting real steamy." And it's like, I get that the late night hosts are doing it for a laugh and because it makes the actors uncomfortable and they're like, but it's one, shitting on the fan community that bolsters your sales, which is not okay. And two, like, it's not appropriate to make somebody uncomfortable for your own entertainment. It is gross. And it's also like, you're asking Tom Felton to, wrangle with an image that's him and his co-star in like a very sexual scenario.
Somebody
like,
that you've known since childhood. Like, please.
That's a whole other can of worms, my guy.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, right, it comes down to boundaries. And like, different communities have set up different boundaries. Teese, would you like to read this quote for me?
One topic of debate in RPF is who can be written about. Non-famous family members were usually off limits. Thank God. For example, Talific, a Metallica mailing list founded in 1999, had a no wives rule. However, this rule was never universal, and in the age of social media, where relatives of famous people are also online, the line between famous and non-famous is blurred. In One Direction fandom in the 2010s, many otherwise non-famous people associated with the band are on social media, and band members' parents appeared in the band's films and on The X Factor. Meanwhile, in Fandom in the 2000s, many of the wives were well-known or famous, so the non-famous rule didn't apply.
The thing that, like, I respect this rule, I understand it, but the thing that really bothers me about it, right, is that, like, famous people are people too. Famous people deserve like privacy and boundaries, and it feels really weird to me to like sit there and say like, well, it's okay for me to write about Harry Styles and Louis Tomlinson fucking because they're famous. And because those are their personas that are public and outward facing, but like, their family members don't have personas that are public facing, so I won't write about them.
So help me God, if any of you do anything fan fiction related about Dolly Parton's husband, you are catching these hands. Like, he purposely stays out of the limelight for a reason.
But even being in the Dollyverse, in the limelight, Miss Dolly, like
Miss Dolly,
I
Miss
don't
Dolly
think it's
loves her
appropriate
privacy.
to write porn, or like even just like write like just little fictional stories about Dolly Parton, talking about like Harry Styles and Louis Tomlinson. Unfortunately, with Real Person Slash, there are people who believe that the people they're shipping are actually a couple, or that the actor is secretly closeted. And that's when you get fans who are like demanding to know the sexuality of an actor, and it's none of their fucking business. And like, I think that's when you see this line crossed where it's like people feel really entitled to private information about celebrities, and they feel owed it because they're a celebrity, they exist to entertain me. And it's like, no, that is still a human being and a person who deserves to have boundaries, and like, unfortunately, whose boundaries are frequently violated by other people, including paparazzi, but like also fellow entertainers for like their own clout. I forget like what show or segment it was, but like Adam Driver got really upset because they were trying to show him a clip of his own acting, and he was like, listen, I don't like to watch myself. It makes me incredibly uncomfortable. And people are like, oh my God, what a baby. He's overreacting. And it's like, he had a boundary. He made it very clear, and people still violated that. And so, like, it's really hard for me personally to reckon, like, violating that boundary, even if that person never found out about it. Like, that doesn't make it okay. Because I understand that I am using a logical fallacy here in going from one relatively small thing to one extreme, but, like, a person being unconscious doesn't make it okay for you to then, like, touch them, the absence of consent is not consent.
Yeah, exactly.
The absence of information and the option to consent is not consent, you know?
Yeah.
And actors, creators, random people don't owe themselves any more than they already freely give. And they, like anyone else, are allowed to revoke consent and draw back from public eye and attention. And, like, they're allowed to say, like, I might have done this in the past, but I'm not okay with doing that now, you know? And, like, you as a regular human person are allowed to do that in your normal life, you know? I don't have, like, a hard yes or no, right, about, like, is real person fiction okay or not okay? Because I don't think there is one, you know? I think there's nuance and consideration in every topic, and, like, the distance you have from the people you're writing about, and the distance through time that you have about the people you're writing about, and, like, what is the intent behind your writing, and, like, is that intent actually getting across, you know? Like, when we talk about Hamilton, which is a really great example of, like, real person fiction, you know, it portrays Alexander Hamilton pretty favorably, you know? So I don't think there's necessarily damage to his legacy being done there. He's also a dead man whose story is incredibly prolific and accessible in other mediums. Hamilton is not the first story of him, you know? Whereas, like, Harry Styles is still alive. He's still a real person. And, like, making gay fan fiction about him constantly, like, I don't know that that's productive or helpful. Why do you need to share it?
Horny. I mean, One Direction fans. Babygate. Every day I think about Babygate.
I don't know about Babygate.
Oh my god. One Direction fans thought that one of the One Direction members had a baby and the baby was fake.
Was it Zayn?
Maybe. I don't even fucking know.
Don't get distracted with Babygate. Babygate's something we can talk about. Don't look up Babygate. Stop it. What are your feelings about, you know, what we've talked about and what I've shared with you? Get off the Babygate tab, Teese.
I don't want to yuck anybody's yum, but we gotta stop doing this, guys. We have to. I can't do this anymore. If any of you write RPF about me, I'm gonna.
You in earlier episodes encouraged people to write RPF about you.
I think I changed my mind. Actually, it would be really funny if you did. Don't do it about Cass though. He's uncomfortable, but you know.
I think about the mortifying ordeal of being known.
Yeah.
Right? And then I think about the mortifying ordeal
help me God, if you talk about my boobs,
you.
I will... Blocked. Don't do it. I think there is a point about being respectful towards people. Like, we could have this no wives rule, no unfamous people. Like, dude, not everything has to be online. Like we were saying in our internet safety episode, not everything has to be online. It's okay. Not everything needs to be a tool to give you online validation or clout. Like, share your RPF with your friends if they think it's funny. Don't. I don't want to see it. I mean, yeah, okay. I've read it. I've read it before. But
I mean, like, yeah, we read it, and, like, I think the ABO episode is, like, a perfect example of it, right? Where, like, the actors having very real lives and, like, actual wives became an issue with people who were reading the fanfiction. They became upset by it. Yeah.
The fic literally stopped updating because
people got upset that their ship wasn't happening, and it's like, those are real people, they're not characters, and, like, I hate to tell you, in real life, your ship isn't canon.
Sorry. I'm sorry to break this to you, but
Jared Padalecki and Jensen Ackles are not fucking.
No amount of fanfiction writing will suddenly make them divorce their wives, admit that they're gay, and then they kiss.
The fact that there is, like, a literal name for members of fandom who are of the belief that, like, their real person ships are real,
Mhm.
and like that they will harass the real life people about it. Like, that's scary. I'm not gonna say the term. You can go look it up. Go educate yourself. But it's just, I think that like there is a way to handle real person fiction and like parody responsibly. So I think the super, and I mean, like, before we even conclude, the other part I want to say about all of this is like, before you go shaming someone or attacking someone or like demanding, you know, rationalizations for their real person fan fiction, also consider that they might be like a baby or a teenager on the internet who maybe doesn't know that it's super appropriate to post their sexual fantasies about YouTube streamers kissing.
Mhm.
Consider that. Doesn't make it okay, but you know, you can approach those people with kindness and good-naturedness and say like, hey, I don't think this is appropriate.
Mhm.
Or like, the person you're writing about is underage, this isn't cool. I think the big thing for me that I learned in all of this is like, one, it was really illuminating to understand the history of real person fiction, and that like it wasn't something that just came about because of overzealous fans and like people who might be would-be stalkers, you know, who like have maybe taken like an obsession too far. And I'm not saying that people who write real person fan fiction are all would-be stalkers. Absolutely not. There's a very, 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 very small margin. But it was nice to know, I guess maybe not nice to know, it was actually kind of repugnant to know that like this was a thing that was like started in large part by publishing agencies to make money off of actors they had under contract, you know, like removing it from the historical fiction context. Like, the modern era of historical fiction was production companies cashing in on actors in like a way that I find really nefarious, and like I don't necessarily blame people for picking up in it, because it was started by corporations, as many things are, and people are just following in their stead. If you enjoyed the podcast, it is wonderful and so fantastic that you made it to the end of the episode. Huge thank you for that. Maybe consider sharing us with a friend, leaving a review on whatever podcasting app you listen to us on, iTunes, Spotify, whatever that is. If you are interested in helping us out, you know, supporting us, making it possible for more guests in the future, beefing up the podcast, better audio equipment, you can support us via Ko-fi with one-time donations, or join us on Patreon. Patrons get access to exclusive bonus episodes, they get access to polls to vote for monthly topics, all sorts of fun stuff. If you want to find more information about us or reach out to us, you can find all relevant information to that on authorsnotepod.com. We are on Twitter, and we are on Instagram, and we are there as Authors Note Pod. If you want to find more of me, you can find me pretty much everywhere on the internet. My name is Cass, and I'm all over the place as Val Hethella. That's ValHethella. Teese, if people want to find more of you, where can they get you at?
You can find me at Vicunad, that is Vicunad. If you liked our theme music, that was made by James Wyulo. You could find him on Bandcamp under James Y. And Cass, who did our cover art?
Our cover art is by the wonderful Jala, i.e. Nyaliest, everywhere on the internet. You can find her on Twitter at Nyaliest. That's Nyalliest. Until next time, read critically, wear your mask, and be considerate of others and their boundaries. Bye!
Bye!